Hi, I'm Dr. Debbie Norris. I'm the founder and director of the Mindfulness Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and I'm also the director of the Psychobiology of Healing program at American University. The National Institute of Health has identified pain as one of the primary conditions of concern for healthcare in this country. Over 100 million people suffer from chronic pain in the United States. That's about a third of our entire population. What has happened is NCAM has spent billions of dollars doing research on mind-body therapies such as meditation, yoga, tai chi, qigong, also acupuncture, similar approaches that we used to think of as complementary or now identified as integrative mind-body practices. Because people have been using these practices without what we've called sufficient data. Now, after considerable research, the data is supporting what individuals were reporting and believing in the first place, which is that these mind-body therapies are making a difference. The data shows that mind-body therapies indeed are the evidence-based best practices for treatment of chronic pain. Heretofore, the standard of healthcare, the medical standard of care, has been to treat pain, particularly chronic pain, pharmacologically with opiates and other drugs that have an issue because they're inclined to be addictive. So, whilst they've been the standard of care, they've had some very serious adverse side effects, and indeed we've identified also in this country, in our nation, a serious drug abuse or problem with addiction, some of which does stem from initial use of prescription drugs for treatment of pain. So in addition to working more effectively to treat pain, mind-body therapies also have the benefit of positive side effects rather than adverse addictive side effects like opiates do. So mind-body therapies are now being established as the evidence-based best practices for the medical standard of care for treatment of chronic pain. And these do include self-care practices such as meditation, yoga, tai chi, and qigong. Well, it's hard for me to imagine that it's a question as to how it is that self-care mind-body practices can be more effective than the administration of an exogenous drug. First off, the reason the drugs work in our bodies is because they're acting on a system that's already in place. It's a system that's already in place because it works with our lifestyle. So as our lifestyle changes one way or another, this endogenous system modulates. And we have found, interestingly, that we can self-modulate that system either by taking drugs, which then we're dependent upon the drug for self-modulation, or we can self-modulate through our lifestyle practices, what we eat, how much sleep we get, whether we're well hydrated, whether we're doing stress management techniques, and whether we're getting sufficient exercise and oxygen into our system. So when we do these practices, we find that we're creating significant changes. We are self-modulating on the same system that drugs would have otherwise worked on, but without the use of drugs and without the potential adverse side effects from these medications. So, for example, exercise. We've long known, since Dr. Candace Pert published on this in the 1980s, that rigorous exercise like jogging causes an elevation in endorphin levels. Our endorphin levels go up. Well, that's what opiates do. Opiates raise our endorphin levels. Endorphins function to relieve or moderate pain in our bodies. So we can do it by taking opiates, or we can do it by getting more rigorous exercise. But now in the more recent years, we've also discovered that even sitting on a mat, meditating, raises our endorphin levels. So a variety of lifestyle practices are proving to work in these ways. Endorphins are not the only biochemical in our body that we can self-modulate through mind-body practices. Serotonin is another one that we have heretofore modulated using antidepressant drugs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, such as Prozac, Paxil, Effexor, and so forth. But now we're finding that even sitting on a cushion and meditating or doing gentle exercises like Tai Chi and Qigong cause an increase in our serotonin levels. And an increase, when we look more in detail, that has significant impacts not only on our mood, improving our mood, but also in modulating our immune system, improving immune function, reducing inflammation, and many other side effects, balancing hormones and so forth. So these self-care practices, such as meditation, yoga, and Tai Chi, are ways that we can act on our own bodies, in our own systems, without the use of an exogenous drug to do so, to elicit the same effects or even better effects, because they're more generalized. It integrates the various functions of the body to do these self-care practices. The concept of mind-body and mind-body-spirit is just that. It's a concept. It's not a concept that all cultures have considered. Indeed, it was Descartes who first identified a possible distinction or a conceptual distinction between the mind and the body. So it's an interesting effect to consider that they're actually the same thing. They're just different perspectives on this thing. The self. We do tend to identify the mind as the activity of the brain or the consciousness of the organism we call self, and we do tend to identify the body as something else. Indeed, in our culture, it seems that we disengage. We have a different perspective on everything from about here down as we do from here up. We tend to be engaged in this part and disengage from that part of the body. But it's a perceptual concept, not necessarily a reality. Mind-body practices are a way of integrating your consciousness with the physical experience. We do have an adaptive characteristic as living organisms to be able to tune out physical pain that we're experiencing. And this is adaptive again. In a fight or flight situation, if you're fighting for your life and you're wounded or injured, it's not adaptive at that moment to be concerned about physical pain. If you're cut in the heat of a battle, it's not the time to say, hang on a second, I'm wounded, let me tend to my wounds. It is adaptive at that moment to not pay attention to the pain and to proceed with the crisis at hand, if you will. So what happens is, after the stressful situation or the fight or flight situation, then we tend to become more conscious of our wounds. Then our consciousness opens and allows the pain to arise so that we can tend to our wounds. I think what's going on in a lot of cases with more chronic pain is that we are not finding circumstances in which we feel safe enough for the consciousness to open and to become conscious of the wounds, which seems to play an integral role in how these mind-body therapies are actually working to heal pain. What we've identified in terms of the mechanisms of action, what we've identified in terms of the active ingredients of these practices is a interoceptive awareness, that is, an internal awareness of what's going on in the body. We become, in my research on using meditation to treat pain, for example, in people who've had chronic pain, initially there's an increase in the awareness of pain. And then over time, there's a gradual decrease in the pain until it becomes significantly reduced or even eliminated. So the practices that are working, the active ingredients in these mind-body therapies that are working, that have been identified, are one, interoceptive awareness of what's going on. Now, we do have a reaction when we pay attention, say we've had a wounded body part such as the knee or hip. When we get there, it's achy, we take our consciousness away. It's become a reflex to go to the stress response, to take our consciousness away from the pain. So letting it go there and stay there seems to play a role in the healing process. The second thing that's been identified is that when you get there with compassion. So we don't go and say, I've got a bad knee. We don't have bad body parts. We have body parts that are speaking to us. We have body parts that we've finally opened our consciousness to recognize that it's in distress and needs our attention. Our bodies are beautifully designed that once we get our consciousness there, the system begins to supply what's needed. Cartilage heals, bones heal, muscles heal, flesh heals. All kinds of things are able to restore function. Once we recognize that there is a problem there to start with. And so the active ingredients of these mind-body practices, which are characteristic of meditation, yoga, tai chi, qigong, and many other self-care practices, are interoceptive awareness, what is going on in the body, and two, arriving there with compassion. I would say some other things that we're going to identify that we might look at in further research are the role of feeling safe, the role of feeling like it's safe to pay attention. We don't need to put our focus on some crisis at hand. We can pause and put our focus on how it feels in the body. And the use of the breath as a tool for creating that sensation of safety. Basically, the hypothalamus is an alerting organ. It's up there checking, are we okay? Are we okay? Is there enough oxygen? When there's deprivation of oxygen, this elicits the fight or flight or stress response. When there's enough oxygen, then we tend to revert the hypothalamus back to normal function and elicit the relaxation response. These, either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic response, are literally cascades of reactions within the body that start at the hypothalamus in the brain, or perhaps at the perceptual organs, the eyes, the ears, or sensing sufficient oxygen, then activates the pituitary and then the adrenal glands, and then hormones are sent out that cause a global effect on the body, either eliciting the relaxation response or the stress response. When we feel safe, when we're breathing, when we're taking nice, deep, soothing breaths, this elicits the relaxation response, creates a situation in which you might identify as feeling safe, and allows this deeper consciousness, this interoceptive awareness, this self-reflection, consciousness of self. And then when we arrive there with compassion, we don't go in and panic, oh no, I've got a problem with the knee, I don't know what to do with it. We go in there with compassion, we say, my knee is speaking to me. I'm hearing it. I'm able to let it heal now. It's safe to heal. So some of the things that we do that allow ourselves to feel safe is first recognize we spend so much time in a stress response, it becomes second nature to be in the stress response, to maintain tension in the body, to breathe shallowly, to hyper-focus. Some researchers have identified that when we're using electronic equipment, we are either holding our breath or not breathing very deeply. And this becomes a conditioned state. We're not even recognizing that we are holding on to unnecessary tension. So one of the things you could do in one of these mind-body classes, meditation, tai chi classes, begin to become aware of places where you're actually holding on to tension in the body can relax the face. We can relax the mind. We can let tension out of the shoulders. We can take the weight of the world off of our shoulders and let them relax. I often in a meditation class see people initially sit down clenching themselves. We can make an intention to let go with the body and be in a more open and relaxed state. Another question is, what is the role of practicing these mind-body practices in groups? How does, many people report that practicing in a group has a different effect. They feel different in the group situation than they do practicing on their own at home. We can come back to the concept of how to set up a home practice, but there is something actually unique happening when you practice in a group. Each of us, as a living organism, is emitting an electromagnetic field. And I used to do research on electroencephalography. We'd measure the electromagnetic fields that come off of the brain and the effects of various manipulations on these fields. A lot of research has been done these days on the effects of meditation and the electromagnetic field of the brain, and some research is starting to evaluate the effects on the heart. Indeed, the heart emits a more powerful, a broader electromagnetic field than any other part of the body. And researchers have identified this EMF, if you will, up to 10 to 15 feet away from a human body. So we are literally basking in an electromagnetic field of our own generation. Interestingly, our electromagnetic fields tend to synchronize with each other. So if you put two people in a room together and they come in and initially one's going one way and another's going another way, what you'll see over time is a synchronicity that begins to develop between the two. The two electromagnetic fields begin to become entrained and looking as if they are one. This process of entrainment happens whether we're conscious of it or not, and I would say that in general we are not conscious of this type of entrainment, but we do tend to recognize things like we say, I got a really good vibe from somebody, or somebody seemed positively radiant, and we've even reported situations of love at first sight, which might be a situation in which our heart's entrainment just simply feels really good in the presence of the synchronicity of another person. And so, of course, which is something that's really fascinating, is when you get a group of people together, you're going to see mass entrainment. You're going to see over time that the entire group begins to become synchronized with each other. So when you come into a familiar practice with a group, this entrainment is becoming conditioned and happens much more rapidly, creating a potentially more powerful effect. What's interesting is that these mind-body practices such as yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, are typically taught by yoga teachers, meditation teachers, Tai Chi, Qigong teachers. And as more and more people are coming to these practices to use them for their personal health, we're going to be dealing with people who have special needs. In our classes at the Mindfulness Center, you might not be aware of it, but we have people who've just recently had surgery. We have people who are undergoing chemo or radiation. They might have ports in their body. We have all kinds of people with special needs. They might be working with pain. We have a low back, hip, and knee pain class. And we don't identify people by this, but we do have special classes and special approaches for treating these with a more restorative approach, a more yin approach, a more a slower and gentler approach to begin to incorporate people and our bodies into these practices. Obviously there's a great deal of variety in types of yoga classes. You can go to a yin restorative class, or you can go to an intense class, a hot yoga class, more calisthenic type class. All of them have specific benefits, but the question then, they're as different as night and day. If you come in with back pain, which type of class is the best for you? To date, research on things like yoga for treatment of low back pain, most of the research simply says yoga is good for low back pain. It does not, however, give a specific protocol for the type of yoga to do. So if you go into a very young, intense, hot yoga class that's doing a lot of back bends, that might not be the specific class that's best for your back. Whereas gentle, restorative, supported forward bends might be working better. Or a more interoceptive, meditative approach might be the place to start. So we want our teachers, basically, these are healthcare teachers, to be trained in the use of these mind-body therapies for working with special needs populations. Meditation is useful for the treatment of chronic pain because it facilitates this interoceptive awareness, what I call internal yoga. We do make adjustments. Though you might not see it, I could be relaxing my shoulders. Though you might not see it, I could be dilating my blood vessels. Though you might not see it, I could be allowing a relaxation in my digestive system that facilitates digestion and creates a whole shift in the actual biochemistry of my body. As I shift from the stress response to the relaxation response, there's a whole lot going on that you don't see. So just because you see the overt actions in a yoga class doesn't mean there isn't more actually going on in the yoga class, this subtler internal yoga. And that is absolutely what's going on in a meditation practice. With a mindfulness practice that focuses on something like the breath or other interoceptive cues. So there has been a lot of stigma associated with these practices of meditation and yoga, even Tai Chi and Qigong. And so some people are slow to turn to these specific practices. It's different journeys for different people. We're all on a different path and we all look different, we all function slightly differently. I invite people to begin to explore what's working for you. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, we didn't have quite the fad around meditation or even yoga that we do these days. But what was popular there was brisk walking or even gentle walking, more rigorous forms of exercise, aerobics, weightlifting, and so forth. So it's different paths for different people. Each of us should find our own journey. What I suggest is what really underlies the beginning of these practices is an empowerment towards self-care, empowering people to begin to pay attention to themselves and find things that are working for you. Now that we have a research base, an evidence basis, we have the data that shows that these self-care practices work. Find the self-care practices that work for you. Find the approach. Obviously, somebody who's seriously wounded is not in a situation to begin yoga. I have many people who aren't even ready to stand up to begin their practices. You can do a seated Qigong practice, or you can do meditation laying down. There's somewhere you can start. We had an intern who worked with us at the center who had had serious traumatic injuries, many bones broken, lots of flesh wounds, and other internal injuries. When this person came to in the emergency room, in intensive care actually, what she did was she began meditation, and she continued meditation throughout her visit in intensive care. And many of the nurses remarked at how quickly she healed, at how quickly she recovered, and how little medication she required given her circumstances. So in whatever circumstance you're in, find the practice that works for you. We have a class at the Mindfulness Center that's called Low Back, Hip, and Knee Pain. for lack of room on the schedule to say much more about it. It's a mind-body class for people who are suffering from pain, particularly in the lower body. And I see the most remarkable effects occurring in that class. I have had a number of people walk out of class after the first, second, or third class and say, I've been in chronic pain for years. I was told I needed surgery, and the pain is gone. What happened? They don't understand. Not all of us know the science behind these practices, but all of us can experience the benefits of these practices. My personal story begins with my interest in dance and other forms of physical exercise when I was a child. I was a ballet dancer at first and then branched into modern and many other forms of dance, African and jazz and even Spanish and ballroom dancing. So I had the benefit of being physically active and knowing the mechanisms of how the body works as a child. And I continued that through college and a bit through graduate school. But eventually life got busy and I had my children and put more of my focus on their care than my own care, not necessarily setting the best role model at that time, until eventually I personally became ill and finally was diagnosed by the chief of internal medicine at Kaiser with fibromyalgia, a state of chronic pain and tenderness, and I was so handicapped that I could not lift my infant son. The only way I could hold him was to lay down on the ground and let him crawl up on top of me. I was in so much pain I couldn't carry books or even open a door. I think the low point was when I went to take my kids to a movie store. This was back when we rented movies, and walking through the store, I saw Jane Fonda's movie Buns of Steel. And I reflected on being told by my physician that day that I was going to need to get a wheelchair and that I should purchase this wheelchair before I needed it, because once you really need the wheelchair, it's hard to shop for a wheelchair. And I thought to myself, the only buns of steel I'm going to have is a wheelchair underneath me. That was really the low point in my life, in this part of the journey. And it was the next morning I woke up and I said, I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to go differently. And I remember all the details about that morning. I remember the yellow sheets. I remember the sunlight coming through the windows. I remember the curtains. I remember looking at my hands and the thought, I'm going to do this differently. And with that inspiration, I went back to what I had learned as a child, and I started exercising. Now, let me tell you, my first exercise was to go for a walk and breathe and cry because I was in so much pain. And I walked and breathed and cried until I was able to walk and breathe without crying. And then I would walk and breathe and stretch. And then I would stretch until I cried. And then I would walk and breathe and stretch until I stopped crying. And gradually I went back, and remember this was back when aerobics was big, before yoga was so big, and so I started going to aerobics classes. And I'd stand in the back of the room and I would do aerobics and cry until eventually I was doing aerobics and not crying. Mostly crying out of frustration that the limits on what my body could do were so shallow and so compressing, that I was so limited in what I was physically able to do. The pain, it was neither worse nor better, and depend as I exercised, but gradually over days the pain started to subside. It started to disappear. I knew I was on the right track. Being a research scientist, I had looked into the research on fibromyalgia, what was going on. And I had seen that muscle biopsies of painful muscles in people with fibromyalgia indicated that the muscle was deficient in oxygen. So I didn't consider this a symptom of fibromyalgia. I considered this one of the causes of my muscle pain. And so I figured if I could get oxygen into those muscles, they would no longer hurt. Indeed, that's what worked. So these breathing exercises, these gentle stretching exercises as I breathed to allow circulation to carry oxygen into my muscles, it was working. Once that had accomplished its goals, then going into aerobics classes where I was actually breathing more deeply and getting even more oxygen into my muscles started to work, and I started to feel relief. And I kept going. I started working out with weights. I eventually got to the point where I could bench press my own body weight. I won some competitions. I had fun with it. I didn't need all of that just to live a good quality life, but I did go through my own personal journey of discovery of self-care. That and several other personal experiences of using mind-body practices and being a research scientist, seeing that many people were finding relief from what we define as chronic diseases. We're actually finding relief and recovering from these conditions. And I started to pay attention to what they were doing. And one person would change their diet and recover. Somebody recovered from multiple sclerosis by making drastic dietary changes, and then was convinced that everybody, no matter what their condition, should make these same dietary changes. But then somebody else recovered from MS by beginning an exercise regime involving yoga and also meditation, and then was convinced that everybody should start to do meditation and yoga. And I saw that it was different paths for different people. And so I started wondering, what underlies, what unifies all of these different paths that are leading to success in treatment of chronic pain and other chronic conditions? And what I found was it was lifestyle practices. It was personal self-care lifestyle choices, things that we can do for ourselves. And then as a professor teaching behavioral medicine and other psychology classes, the question is, okay, so we know that living a better lifestyle would be good for us. How do we make these behavioral changes? What allows us to make lifestyle changes? What gives us the inspiration and the motivation to make these changes? And as I said before, we've identified two of those things. Interoceptive awareness, paying attention to what's going on inside the body, and doing so with compassion. So somebody once asked me, why did you call it the Mindfulness Center? It's because mindfulness is the basis, it's the foundation for behavioral change. It's what underlies the ability to make changes in your life that facilitate healing, that are preventative for disease, and create optimal well-being and optimal living. Mind-body practices such as meditation, yoga, and Tai Chi have found their way into major medical centers across the country. And having watched this the past 10, 20 years actually, I'm pleased to say that the Department of Veterans Affairs has been one of the first places to start making some of these changes in their protocols. And I think perhaps this has again been because of a grassroots effort. I'm sorry that it might not have been initiated at the administrative level, but I have seen an outpouring of people who provide mind-body services and who teach mind-body practices going into the veterans medical centers and offering these services for free, providing training in meditation, providing yoga classes for veterans and for the people who work at the VA, providing Reiki, providing acupuncture, and so forth. So it has really been increasing awareness at the VA hospitals of the use of these practices. Now, one of my personal concerns is that these approaches have been being offered in the hospitals without data supporting their use. Now, although I'm a firm believer from my own personal experience and from other classes I've taught and research that I've done in the value of these practices, we have needed to identify scientifically that there is a value to these approaches. So I have taken some of my graduate students and we've gone into the DC VA Medical Center to validate the use of a mindfulness meditation program that was being used there, to demonstrate the validity of using this approach in the treatment of pain, people suffering from chronic pain, PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and indeed we have found that there are clinical benefits to the use of meditation, to the practice of meditation for people suffering from these conditions. As of more recently, we have seen a change in the protocol in the Department of Veterans Affairs for the treatment of pain. They now have an initiative. They put out a press release about what's called the Opioid Safety Initiative, which suggests that we use mind-body therapies such as meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, and acupuncture as a first approach for the treatment of pain, particularly chronic pain. And I applaud this initiative. I think we're going to see great benefits. This has been supported by research and the same sort of news coming out of the National Institute of Health, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Medicine. I think we're going to start to see this shift seep into our standard of care in medical centers across the country and in private practice, and of course in our own personal practices.